Commander Carter stepped off the military transport with the calm poise of someone accustomed to authority, but authority earned quietly, not demanded through bluster. The fort air was crisp that morning, carrying the faint scent of pine and the faint metallic tang of the training grounds. Soldiers milled about, some jogging in formation, others running errands under the watchful eyes of their superior officers. Adjusted her jacket and walked into the base, her boots clicking softly on the concrete as if announcing nothing and everything at the same time. No one paid much attention at first. To the casual observer, she appeared to be another consultant, perhaps a liaison officer sent to inspect paperwork or evaluate minor procedural adjustments. Yet there was something about her, the steady way she surveyed the area, the calm certainty in her stride, that made even the busiest soldiers pause briefly. It wasn't arrogance, it was awareness. Every movement, every detail seemed to register in her mind. Notice the frayed edges of tents, the neglected paint on the fence posts, and the subtle tension in soldiers' shoulders. Colonel Briggs, commander of the base for nearly a decade, noticed her immediately, or at least he thought he did. He leaned back in his leather chair in his office, swirling a cup of lukewarm coffee, and sneered. "Another paper-pushing officer," he muttered to his aide, a young lieutenant nervously standing by the door. "Probably here to read reports and tell me how to run my own base. I've seen enough of these to last a lifetime." Briggs had a reputation, loud, domineering, and dismissive of anyone he assumed to be beneath him. In his mind, fit that category perfectly. She did not seek confrontation. She had a mission, one that required patience, observation, and discretion. Knew the base inside and out before she even spoke a word. Her eyes traveled across the training yard, noting soldiers, posture, their interactions, the subtle unspoken rules that governed their behavior. There were whispers of fear, a hesitation in their movements, and a visible lack of camaraderie that could not be blamed on normal military rigor. The base functioned, but it was held together by fear and intimidation, not respect or teamwork. His first few hours were spent walking the perimeter, inspecting supply depots, and quietly asking junior officers about their routines. She avoided attracting attention, keeping her voice low, her questions neutral. She noticed small things that others ignored. A soldier adjusting a helmet improperly, a maintenance log missing critical entries, a training schedule that had been from the previous year without updates. Each observation added to the mental map she was constructing, a map that painted a picture far more concerning than the outward appearance of military precision. Meanwhile, Colonel Briggs roamed his office with the swagger of a man convinced of his invincibility. He had no idea that this quiet, composed woman moving through his base was no ordinary officer. To him, she was a trivial inconvenience, someone to be tolerated until she left. He muttered sarcastic comments about her to the aide, laughing at things he thought she couldn't hear. He did not. Noted every gesture, every flippant remark, every sneer that passed across his face. She recorded them mentally, but her expression remained calm, unreadable. She did not need to react yet. The time for confrontation would come later, and when it did, it would not be impulsive. It would be decisive. As she moved through the mess hall for a brief lunch, observed more subtle signs of dysfunction. Soldiers avoided eye contact with certain non-commissioned officers. Some whispered hurriedly to one another before looking over their shoulders. Others carried tension in their shoulders, so pronounced it was almost painful to watch. Made mental notes, recognizing a pattern she had seen before in her decades of service. When leadership fails through arrogance and fear, efficiency suffers quietly but dramatically. She was beginning to understand the depth of the problem at Fort. By mid-afternoon, she had visited nearly every key department on the base. She spoke with mechanics, medics, supply officers, and trainers. She asked questions that seemed ordinary but revealed her sharp understanding. How often is the emergency protocol updated? When was the last equipment check? Has anyone reported concerns that were ignored? The answers she received were sobering. Soldiers were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but under the surface, a sense of relief began to show. Finally, someone was asking questions without judgment or anger. Someone was listening. Colonel Briggs, for his part, remained unaware of the storm gathering beneath the calm surface of this new arrival. He spent much of the day patting himself on the back, confident that his control over the base was absolute. He mocked minor details to junior officers in passing, unaware that had been watching. Every sarcastic comment, every dismissive gesture, and every attempt at intimidation was silently recorded by her keen observation. She was not just observing the base's operations. She was observing the man in charge, quietly cataloging his weaknesses and patterns of behavior. As the sun began to dip behind the pine-covered hills surrounding Fort finally paused, she took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The base, seemingly ordinary to a casual observer, revealed itself to her in all its complexity. The small fractures in leadership, the fear masked by discipline, and the potential for both disaster and improvement. Carter, quiet, poised, and unassuming, had arrived not just to observe but to act. And no one, especially Colonel Briggs, had the slightest idea what that would mean. Her first day ended not with confrontation but with quiet calculation. She had made her initial assessments, noted the key issues, and, most importantly, understood the psychology of the base's personnel, and of the man who believed he ruled it without question. Knew the real work had only just begun, and the colonel's ignorance was her greatest advantage. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, as she filed her notes. Tomorrow, the game would begin in earnest, and when it did, Fort would never look the same again. The morning sun barely broke through the mist surrounding Fort, yet the base was already alive with movement. Soldiers ran drills, mechanics checked vehicles, and medics hurried between tents. Commander Carter stepped into the main courtyard, her boots leaving crisp impressions in the dew-soaked ground. She moved deliberately, observing everything: the way soldiers carried themselves, the subtle hierarchy of glances and nods, and the nervous energy that seemed to permeate the air. Every detail mattered, every gesture told a story. Understood instinctively that leadership was not always visible in rank insignia, but in the behavior it inspired. Colonel Briggs was already in the mess hall, surrounded by a group of officers he deemed loyal, his booming voice carrying easily over the din. He mocked a young sergeant for a minor mistake during morning drills, waving a clipboard as if it were a sword. "Seriously, Sergeant, how do you expect to command respect if you can't even line up your squad properly?" Briggs laughed heartily at his own words, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort in the room. The sergeant's face flushed crimson, his jaw tight with suppressed frustration. Others nearby avoided eye contact, their pride and confidence dampened by the colonel's domineering presence. Entered quietly, observing the scene with a steady, unflinching gaze. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge Briggs, and didn't speak above the hum of activity. Yet she noted every detail with precision. The fear in the sergeant's posture, the way the other officers flinched at each of Briggs's exaggerated gestures, the subtle relief when the colonel finally turned his back. These were all signs of a leadership problem. Understood that discipline imposed through fear could never be sustainable. Respect required competence, fairness, and the ability to inspire. After breakfast began her rounds in earnest. She visited the maintenance bays, where soldiers carefully inspected vehicles under fluorescent lights. Many of the trucks were overdue for routine checks, and small but critical safety details had been overlooked. Asked questions softly, observing both the condition of the equipment and the soldiers' reactions. When a mechanic hesitated, she encouraged honesty with a gentle smile. "I'm not here to assign blame," she said quietly, "but I need to understand the reality of operations." Slowly, the soldiers opened up, describing skipped maintenance schedules and rushed inspections ordered directly by officers seeking to cut corners. From the medical tents, learned similar patterns. Medics whispered about outdated protocols and missing supplies. Some admitted to bypassing reporting procedures to avoid reprisals from their superiors. Listened carefully, asking clarifying questions without judgment. She took notes discreetly, mentally mapping out the layers of dysfunction that existed across the base. Unlike Colonel Briggs, who relied on bluster and intimidation, relied on observation, patience, and empathy, a combination that allowed her to gain the trust of those too fearful to speak otherwise. Briggs, meanwhile, wandered the corridors with a swagger that came from unquestioned authority. He mocked officers for trivial errors and exaggerated his own achievements to anyone who would listen. He believed his control over the base was absolute, but saw the cracks in his armor. His arrogance masked insecurity, and his reliance on fear had left a vacuum of genuine respect. Soldiers did what they were told, but only to avoid humiliation. Initiative and innovation were stifled. Recognize the dangerous combination of arrogance and incompetence, a leader confident in appearances, blind to the reality beneath. By midday, had gathered enough observations to begin forming her plan. She visited the supply depots, noting discrepancies between inventory logs and actual stock. Items were missing, damaged, or improperly stored, yet reports were routinely to avoid scrutiny. Soldiers confirmed these irregularities in hushed tones, careful not to draw the attention of the colonel or his aides. Silently documented each point, aware that these seemingly minor oversights could escalate into major operational failures if left unaddressed. Later, she moved to the training grounds, where recruits were undergoing drills under the watchful eyes of senior non-commissioned officers. Noticed mistakes overlooked, drills executed poorly, and safety protocols ignored. When she quietly corrected one formation, some soldiers looked up in surprise. A few even dared to glance at her with a spark of curiosity. Did not scold. She demonstrated with calm authority. Every adjustment she suggested was precise and professional, highlighting the stark contrast between her method and Briggs's haphazard, fear-driven approach. Back in his office, Briggs was growing increasingly irritated. He had noticed moving through the base, asking questions and subtly highlighting inefficiencies. "She's wasting time," he muttered to an aide. "We don't need outsiders interfering in our operations. Everyone knows how to run this base. I've been doing it for years." Yet he underestimated her completely. His quiet demeanor, her patience, and her ability to gather information without confrontation made her far more formidable than he imagined. He had no idea that the woman he dismissed as trivial would soon have the authority to hold him accountable. By late afternoon, his rounds were complete, and she retreated to a small office to review her notes. Her observations painted a clear picture. Fort's operational failures were systemic, rooted not in the soldiers' abilities but in the leadership that stifled initiative, imposed fear, and avoided accountability. She documented incidents meticulously, missed safety checks, reports, overlooked training deficiencies, and the culture of intimidation instilled by Colonel Briggs. Each note was a puzzle piece, slowly forming a complete image of the dysfunction that had festered for years. Paused and reflected on the day. She had observed the entire base from the sergeant's offices to the training fields, and seen both the overt and subtle ways leadership failures affected morale and performance. Her mind was already formulating a strategy, but she knew patience was critical. The colonel's arrogance would be his undoing. She merely needed to allow it to surface. Her approach was deliberate: observe, document, and prepare. Action would come later, at the moment of maximum impact, when the truth could no longer be ignored. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, left the base briefly for a walk along the perimeter. The mist had lifted, revealing the full expanse of the compound. She observed soldiers winding down after a long day, their fatigue evident but their dedication intact. Recognized the potential that existed beneath the surface, potential squandered by poor leadership. She made a silent vow: Fort would change, but not through force or anger. Change would come through precision, accountability, and the authority she held but had not yet revealed. Returning to her temporary quarters, filed her notes in careful order. She did not boast, and she did not speculate on immediate actions. Instead, she planned methodically, understanding that the true measure of leadership was not in the loudest voice but in the ability to enact lasting, meaningful change. Colonel Briggs, oblivious to her capabilities, remained confident in his dominance, allowed him to believe he still controlled the base. Tomorrow she would continue her rounds, deepen her investigation, and let the seeds of transformation quietly take root. And so the first day ended. Carter had arrived quietly, observed diligently, and begun to understand the intricate web of fear, arrogance, and incompetence that defined Fort. She had already begun to win the trust of soldiers without their realizing it. And Colonel Briggs, still mocking her in his mind as a minor inconvenience, remained blissfully unaware that the quiet woman on his base held the power to reshape its entire future. The morning briefing room at Fort was a cavernous space, filled with the scent of polished wood, stale coffee, and military discipline. Rows of officers sat rigidly at long tables, some clutching notepads, others tapping pens nervously. At the front of the room, Colonel Briggs paced back and forth, delivering instructions in his usual thunderous tone, his voice bouncing off the walls like cannon fire. He exuded confidence, overconfidence, noted silently, as though no one in the room could possibly challenge him. Today, however, the dynamics of the room were about to shift in ways he could not yet imagine. Carter entered quietly, carrying her own set of notes and plans. She did not announce herself, did not demand attention. Instead, she allowed the room to absorb her presence, her calm posture contrasting sharply with Briggs's flamboyant energy. Junior officers glanced at her with curiosity, recognizing a level of competence that they themselves had not dared to express. Briggs, of course, saw nothing but a quiet outsider, a paper officer who would observe, nod politely, and leave without causing disruption. He had no idea how wrong he was. The briefing began as usual, with officers reporting on supply statuses, training progress, and security updates. Briggs interjected frequently, often cutting off detailed reports to assert his control. When a lieutenant mentioned a small procedural adjustment, Briggs waved him off. "We've been doing it this way for 10 years. If it's not broken, don't fix it," he barked, slamming his palm on the table. The room flinched. Officers had learned long ago that contradicting Briggs, even with fact or logic, invited ridicule or public humiliation. Observed silently, her gaze flicking from report to colonel with calm precision. Finally, a junior officer mistakenly referred to an outdated protocol. Briggs's eyes narrowed, and he let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Ah, see, this is why we have paper officers wandering around, thinking they know better than us," he mocked, pointing toward without realizing she was directly in earshot. The lieutenant stammered an apology, but Briggs's grin widened, his ego fully indulged in the moment. Remained seated, unflinching. When the room quieted, she spoke softly, her voice measured and precise. "Colonel, if I may," she began, drawing attention without raising her volume, "I've reviewed the latest operational protocols. I suggest a small adjustment that would improve efficiency and reduce errors during drills. It requires minimal resources and would not disrupt current schedules." Her tone carried authority without aggression, a subtle signal that she knew exactly what she was talking about. Briggs froze, his smirk faltering. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice laced with incredulity. He leaned forward, pointing at her. "Do you really think you can tell me how to run this base? You're a visitor, aren't you?" His arrogance dripped from every syllable. The room was tense. Junior officers stared, unsure whether to support or stay silent in fear of the colonel's wrath. His expression remained calm, almost serene. "I'm here to ensure operations run safely and effectively," she replied evenly. "This adjustment is a recommendation, based on observations across multiple units. If implemented, it could prevent mistakes and improve overall performance." Her choice of words, firm but not confrontational, was deliberate. She was asserting competence without engaging in an outright challenge, creating a subtle tension that only the most observant could sense. Briggs scoffed loudly, dismissing her entirely. "A suggestion? From you?" He gestured dramatically toward the assembled officers, as though the room itself should reject her input. "We've been running this base successfully for years without outsiders poking their noses in. Perhaps you should stick to filing reports and leave real leadership to those who understand the challenges firsthand." He laughed again, certain that he had humiliated her in front of everyone. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Didn't respond immediately. Instead, she made a subtle gesture with her hand, quietly indicating a small correction to a chart on the table. Her knowledge and precision were undeniable. Even without saying a word, the officers could see the value of her insight. Some exchanged glances, their previous fear replaced by curiosity and admiration. The colonel, however, remained oblivious to the subtle shift in loyalty and attention within the room. Briggs tried to regain control, speaking louder, exaggerating his gestures and recounting his long years of experience. He referenced past successes, awards, and commendations, confident that his reputation alone would silence. Yet she remained calm, her eyes focused on him without intimidation. Her silence, her unwavering composure, and the quiet authority she projected created a subtle but undeniable challenge to his dominance. He could not understand why his usual tactics were ineffective. For several minutes, the briefing continued under this uneasy standoff. Offered insights quietly, clearly demonstrating knowledge and experience far beyond what Briggs had assumed. Each time he attempted to belittle her, her calm, precise answers undermined his efforts without a single raised voice. The junior officers in the room began to notice the contrast. One leader relied on fear, the other on competence. They watched silently, captivated by the tension and unsure of what would happen next. Finally, Briggs lost his composure slightly, slamming a hand against the table. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't a debate. If you think you're smarter than me, perhaps you should step outside and try running a unit on your own. Until then, sit down and keep your suggestions to yourself." His tone was aggressive, a sharp escalation from the casual mockery of earlier. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see how it would respond. Remained seated, her calm gaze unwavering. "Colonel, my intent is not to challenge your authority," she said softly, "but to ensure that the men and women under your command can operate efficiently and safely. Ignoring errors does not maintain authority, it jeopardizes operations and lives. I hope you understand the importance of perspective when evaluating protocols." Her words were measured, her tone respectful but firm, commanding attention without confrontation. Briggs stared at her, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He had expected fear, defiance, or silence, not quiet, reasoned authority. He realized too late that his usual tactics, sarcasm, intimidation, loud mockery, were ineffective. Had established a presence without aggression, and in doing so, shifted the balance of the room subtly but irrevocably. The junior officers who had been cowering began to whisper among themselves, nodding her competence and composure. Some even dared to nod subtly, acknowledging her insight without drawing the colonel's ire. By the end of the briefing, the room had changed. Though Briggs attempted to maintain his authority, it was clear, even to him, that the quiet outsider held knowledge and confidence he could not easily dismiss. His first clash with Briggs had not ended in confrontation or victory in the traditional sense. Instead, it had set the stage for a battle of awareness, patience, and strategic insight. Briggs believed he had the upper hand, but had quietly demonstrated that her authority and understanding far exceeded his assumptions. After the meeting, made notes in her journal. She documented the colonel's behavior, the reactions of officers, and the subtle shifts in attention and trust. She understood the stakes. Briggs's arrogance and reliance on fear were liabilities, but they also provided an opportunity. By continuing to observe, listen, and strategically influence without open conflict, she could prepare for a moment when accountability would become unavoidable. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that patience, composure, and timing were as critical as rank or authority. As she left the briefing room, paused at the doorway and looked back. Briggs, unaware of the undercurrents he had set in motion, continued speaking loudly to his aides. The soldiers filed out quietly, many stealing glances at, some daring to hope that change might finally be coming. Walked to her next assignment, her mind already analyzing what had transpired, planning her next moves. The first clash was over, but the real battle for Fort had only just begun. The day after the tense briefing, Fort awakened under a crisp, gray sky that hinted at rain. Commander Carter moved through the base with quiet determination, her presence calm but commanding. The first clash with Colonel Briggs had set the tone, but knew that the battle for lasting change could not be won in words alone. She needed evidence, insight, and patience. Every corner of the base, every officer, every procedure was a piece of the puzzle. Her mission was clear: identify failures, understand the culture, and prepare the groundwork for accountability. Began her rounds in the administrative offices. Paperwork stacked high on desks, filing cabinets overflowing, and reports left unsigned painted a picture of neglect. She carefully examined operational logs, maintenance schedules, and personnel records. Her eyes sharpened as she noted discrepancies. Equipment listed as inspected when records indicated it hadn't been touched, training logs showing drills completed that soldiers admitted were skipped, safety reports missing critical signatures. Each oversight told a story, not of incompetence alone, but of a system that had been allowed to fail under fear-driven leadership. She spoke quietly with staff, ensuring conversations were discreet. One logistics officer hesitated before speaking, glancing toward the colonel's office. "Sir, the transport vehicles are overdue for inspection," he whispered. "I've reported it before, but nothing ever changes." Nodded, encouraging openness without judgment. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I need you to be honest with me. Nothing here will be used against you personally. My goal is to understand the truth." The officer exhaled, relief evident, and began detailing a series of overlooked maintenance issues that had quietly persisted for months. The medics revealed a similar pattern. Walked through the medical wing, observing equipment, training materials, and first aid kits. She noticed expired medical supplies tucked away in cabinets, missing documentation for emergency drills, and haphazard storage of sensitive materials. Nurses and medics hesitated to speak at first, their fear of reprimand from Briggs clear in their body language. Slowly, as trust developed, they began to share the hidden challenges of the base: understaffed shifts, ignored safety protocols, and years of minor emergencies covered up to avoid the colonel's wrath. Took detailed notes, mentally cataloging every problem. Across the training grounds, observed drills being conducted under the watchful eyes of senior non-commissioned officers. Soldiers executed formations mechanically, but attention to detail was inconsistent. In one unit, she noticed that a critical safety check had been skipped. Approached quietly, correcting the oversight without confrontation. Her calm and precise instructions drew attention, not through authority alone, but through competence. Soldiers began to take notice, realizing that unlike Briggs, directives were rooted in knowledge, clarity, and genuine concern for operational success, rather than ego or intimidation. Colonel Briggs, meanwhile, had started to sense that the quiet officer was more than she appeared. He had noticed her moving through the base, speaking with personnel, and asking pointed questions about operations and morale. "She's meddling," he muttered to an aide. "We don't need someone poking her nose into things she doesn't understand." He failed to notice that his very underestimation of made her investigation easier. Every flippant comment, every sarcastic dismissal, every mocking gesture was quietly observed and recorded, forming part of a pattern that would ultimately expose his failings. His work was meticulous. She compared operational reports to real-world observations, cross-checked logs against maintenance schedules, and interviewed multiple personnel about procedures and morale. Patterns emerged: repeated negligence, cover-ups to protect the colonel's reputation, and a culture of fear that prevented anyone from speaking out. Each revelation confirmed what it suspected: the base functioned, but only barely. Efficiency and morale were casualties of leadership that relied on intimidation rather than respect. Her attention to detail extended even to the smallest elements. She noticed how the soldiers moved through hallways, hesitant when passing certain officers, quick to offer exaggerated salutes to avoid scrutiny. She noted how non-commissioned officers avoided eye contact when reporting errors, and how even minor missteps were punished disproportionately. Cataloged everything, knowing that understanding the psychology of both the staff and Colonel Briggs was key to effecting change. Authority without insight, she thought, was fragile. Fear without accountability was fleeting. By mid-afternoon had compiled a substantial body of evidence. She returned to her temporary office to organize her notes, creating a detailed account of inefficiencies, failures, and procedural lapses. Each entry included observations, staff statements, and supporting documentation from logs and reports. She noted patterns of negligence, repeated procedural errors, and direct consequences of fear-driven leadership. The list was extensive, but she was methodical. Every claim was, every detail documented. No one could dismiss her findings as rumor or exaggeration. Colonel Briggs, increasingly irritated by his presence, confronted one of his aides about her investigations. Why is she everywhere, talking to everyone, checking logs like she owns the place? His voice was sharp, tinged with both frustration and disbelief. The aide shifted uncomfortably. Sir, she seems thorough, yes, but she's polite and professional. I think she's just doing her job, he replied cautiously. Briggs scoffed, unwilling to consider the possibility that the woman he dismissed might possess far more authority and insight than he realized. As the day drew to a close, walked the perimeter once more. Rain began to drizzle, turning the ground into a slick carpet of mud and leaves. Soldiers were leaving the training grounds, exhausted from the day's drills, yet could see subtle changes in their expressions. Some glanced at her with a mixture of hope and curiosity. A few smiled faintly, acknowledging her quiet support and guidance. She had begun, almost imperceptibly, to earn their trust, a trust that Briggs's mocking and intimidation could never achieve. Returning to her quarters, reviewed the day's findings in detail. Her mental map of fort had expanded. Operational failures were intertwined with human behavior, systemic neglect, and a culture of fear. The colonel's arrogance had blinded him to reality but had seen it clearly. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Briggs remained confident, unaware that every sarcastic comment, every attempt at intimidation, and every public mockery had been quietly catalogued. His arrogance would be his undoing. By nightfall, drafted her initial report for the Pentagon's internal review team. She included observations, interviews, photographic evidence of equipment issues, and a detailed account of procedural lapses. Every entry was factual, precise, and professional. She knew that confrontation without evidence would accomplish nothing. Accountability required facts, and she had gathered them in abundance. Briggs might mock her in public, but the truth, carefully documented, would speak louder than any arrogance or bluster. Before sleep, reflected on the day. She had deepened her understanding of the base, its personnel, and its flawed leadership. She had observed how fear had replaced respect, how incompetence had been masked by intimidation, and how the colonel's ego had blinded him to the base's true needs. But she had also seen potential, dedicated soldiers, loyal non-commissioned officers, and a foundation that could be rebuilt. Change would not be instantaneous, but it was possible, and she was prepared to make it happen. Tomorrow, she would continue her investigation, uncovering deeper layers of dysfunction and slowly building the case for accountability. The colonel, still unaware of the storm gathering around him, remained confident in his control. But his patient, meticulous approach was laying the groundwork for a reckoning he could neither foresee nor prevent. Fort was on the precipice of transformation, and she held the key. The morning mist clung to Fort like a veil as soldiers gathered on the expansive training grounds for a routine drill. Boots scuffed against the damp earth, metal clinked against equipment, and the rhythmic cadence of commands filled the air. Carter stood slightly apart, notebook in hand, observing silently. Her presence was calm, professional, and deliberate, Yet she radiated authority that drew subtle glances from soldiers who had begun to notice her composed confidence. The colonel, of course, saw none of this. Colonel Briggs strutted across the field, barking orders with theatrical exaggeration. Today, his ego demanded an audience, and every soldier was expected to recognize his superiority. When approached the front line to correct a minor procedural error in formation, Briggs saw his opportunity. With a booming laugh that echoed across the yard, he stepped forward, pointing a finger directly at her. "Ah, and here's our paper officer," he jeered, voice dripping with mockery. "Perhaps you'd like to tell us how real soldiers should move in a real operation." The assembled troops froze, caught between their respect for and their fear of the colonel's wrath. Briggs laughed again, relishing the attention. "Maybe you should stick to filing reports, ma'am," he barked, exaggerating each word. "Leave the real military work to officers who actually know what they're doing." His tone was cruel, designed to embarrass in front of everyone. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the most seasoned soldiers felt a shiver of tension. His reaction, however, was nothing like Briggs expected. She did not flinch, shout, or step back. Instead, she made a small, deliberate adjustment to the formation, her movements precise, calm, and confident. "Colonel," she said softly, yet firmly, "these adjustments ensure the safety and efficiency of the drill. They are based on long-standing operational protocols, not personal preference." Her voice carried quietly but with unmistakable authority. She did not challenge him with anger. She challenged him with competence. The colonel's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. No one had ever addressed him so directly, so calmly, and so effectively in front of the troops. He tried to laugh it off, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, don't lecture me, paper officer. You're out of your depth here," he sneered, taking a step closer. His gesture, meant to dominate, only highlighted the growing contrast between his bluster and his composed professionalism. Some soldiers exchanged quick glances, a mixture of disbelief and quiet admiration. They had been under Briggs's reign of intimidation for years, witnessing his ridicule of junior officers, but his calm response was unlike anything they had seen. She did not provoke anger, nor did she retreat. She simply demonstrated expertise, earning silent respect with every precise movement and word. The psychological impact was immediate. Briggs's authority appeared weaker by comparison, even though he remained oblivious to it. Briggs tried another tactic, sarcastic humor. "Perhaps you'd like to run the next drill, ma'am," he barked, his voice rising. "I'm sure the men would be thrilled to follow your theories." He laughed loudly, glancing around to see the soldiers' reactions. Many lowered their eyes, unsure whether to look at or hide from the colonel's wrath. A few daringly met her gaze, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. Noted every glance, every micro-expression, quietly building a record of the base's morale under Briggs's leadership. Unfazed, continued her adjustments, moving methodically through the formation. Her gestures were precise, her corrections accurate, and her demeanor composed. "Safety and operational efficiency are not matters of theory, Colonel. They are matters of accountability. Every drill completed improperly risks injury and diminishes effectiveness," she stated, her tone factual, firm, and unwavering. She did not shout, she did not mock, and she did not flinch. Every word emphasized competence over ego. Briggs's frustration grew visible. Sweat formed at his temples and his face reddened. He attempted to regain control, barking orders that clashed with corrections. The soldiers, sensing the tension, hesitated. The drill slowed as Briggs shouted, attempting to dominate, and calmly intervened where necessary, ensuring the exercise continued safely. Her actions, though subtle, highlighted the colonel's inability to lead effectively without intimidation. After several tense minutes, Briggs's outburst reached a peak. He took a step directly in his path, gesturing broadly with both hands. "Enough, I am the commanding officer here. You will follow my orders or leave." His voice cracked with a mix of rage and disbelief. The soldiers stiffened, expecting to retreat or argue, yet she did neither. She simply looked him in the eye, composed, unwavering, and resolute. "Colonel," she replied calmly, "command is not about making yourself heard through anger or intimidation. Leadership is about ensuring your personnel are safe, confident, and competent. When procedures are ignored, no one benefits, not you, not the troops, not the mission. My intent is to support, not undermine, but errors must be addressed. Her tone was respectful, professional, and unyielding, leaving no room for Briggs to dominate without exposing his weaknesses further. The colonel froze, his mouth opening and closing, searching for a retort. He could not lash out without further undermining his own authority. The soldiers watched silently, sensing a subtle but undeniable shift in the power dynamic. Briggs's attempts at dominance were failing, and his calm, competent presence was becoming increasingly influential. For the first time, many realized that Briggs's bluster was insufficient to mask systemic failures. The drill concluded and gathered her notes, her movements composed and deliberate. Briggs, furious but unable to confront her without further embarrassment, stormed off to his office. Behind him, soldiers whispered softly, a mixture of relief, admiration, and curiosity. Had not humiliated Briggs, but she had demonstrated authority, expertise, and composure, qualities that many had longed to see in a leader. The psychological victory was subtle but undeniable. Back in her temporary office, cataloged the events of the day. She noted every public mockery, every sarcastic remark, and every subtle acknowledgement from the soldiers. Briggs's behavior, while arrogant, had exposed patterns of intimidation and incompetence that could now be documented and addressed systematically. Understood that patience, composure, and precise documentation were more powerful than confrontation. Her plan was unfolding. The base would change, and Briggs, unknowingly, was accelerating the process. By evening, reviewed the day with meticulous attention. She had observed not only operational flaws but also the psychological landscape of the base. Soldiers' trust, previously suppressed by fear, had begun to shift subtly toward her. Briggs remained confident, unaware that his attempts to mock and dominate had failed and, in fact, strengthened her credibility. Smiled faintly, recognizing the pattern. Leadership built on fear is fragile. Leadership built on competence, respect, and composure is enduring. As night fell, prepared for the next day's rounds. She would continue her investigations, documenting failures, supporting soldiers, and observing the colonel's reactions. Briggs's arrogance would not last, she knew, and every misstep, every sarcastic remark, and every attempt to assert dominance would be recorded for accountability. The base was on the cusp of change, and Carter was the quiet, unwavering force driving it forward. And somewhere deep in his office, Briggs sat fuming, completely unaware that his own arrogance was setting the stage for a reckoning far beyond anything he could imagine. The colonel had crossed a line, publicly mocking a superior officer without realizing it, and the consequences, when revealed, would be monumental. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when an unusual convoy of black SUVs rolled through the gates of Fort. Soldiers paused mid-drill, eyes widening, as a sense of anticipation swept across the base. Word spread quickly that a high-ranking inspection team from the Pentagon had arrived for an unannounced evaluation. Colonel Briggs straightened his uniform, his chest puffing with pride. Today, he believed, would be a day to showcase his leadership, proof that the base ran efficiently under his command. He had no idea that everything was about to change. Carter had anticipated the arrival. She moved calmly through the base, her notebook in hand, making her rounds with quiet precision. Unlike Briggs, she did not allow excitement or anxiety to alter her composure. Soldiers glanced at her with subtle curiosity, sensing that she was a stabilizing force in the face of the impending inspection. Some whispered quietly about her calm presence, nodding that she always seemed prepared for any situation, unlike the colonel, who was now packing his office with visible tension. When the inspection team entered the briefing room, Briggs positioned himself at the head of the table, his chest swelling with self-importance. He assumed the team had come to validate his authority, to admire his years of experience, and to commend his leadership style. Officers scrambled to gather paperwork, polish equipment, and adjust the formations they had practiced endlessly in preparation. Briggs cleared his throat, casting a self-satisfied glance toward the assembled personnel, certain that all eyes would be on him. However, stepped forward as the team requested. She moved with the same calm confidence that had distinguished her since the first day at the base. As she approached, whispers filled the room. Who was this quiet officer? Why had she been given the floor? Briggs, smug and oblivious, waved a hand dismissively. "She's just my aide," he muttered under his breath to a nearby officer, expecting the team to ignore her. The whispers turned into stunned silence when removed her jacket, revealing the insignia of a rear admiral. The room froze. Soldiers blinked in disbelief, their jaws slackening. Briggs turned pale, his carefully cultivated confidence faltering as his mouth opened and closed in shock. The woman he had publicly mocked, dismissed, and underestimated for weeks was not only a superior officer, she outranked him by miles. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Every sarcastic remark, every attempt at humiliation, every public mockery now hung heavy in the air, exposing his arrogance in stark relief. The inspection team exchanged glances, equally stunned. They had heard of Rear Admiral Carter's reputation for meticulous leadership, but no one had expected her to arrive personally at Fort. She moved forward, her voice calm, measured, and precise. "Colonel Briggs will provide his overview," she said, nodding to him, "but I will be presenting a comprehensive review of base operations, highlighting areas for improvement and commendable practices alike." Her words were respectful yet authoritative, leaving no room for interruption or ego-driven objection. Briggs swallowed hard, attempting to regain his composure. Yes, of course, Rear Admiral," he stammered, his mind racing. He tried to continue as though nothing had changed, to assert dominance through habit and voice alone. But every officer in the room, every soldier, and every member of the inspection team now understood the truth. Briggs had been humiliated in private and public simultaneously. He had overestimated his control, underestimated capabilities, and failed to recognize her true authority. Began her presentation, methodically detailing the observations she had compiled over the past weeks. She presented evidence of inefficiencies, safety lapses, and procedural oversights. Photographs of outdated equipment, copies of maintenance logs, and records of skipped drills filled the room with undeniable proof. Her calm, professional delivery contrasted sharply with Briggs's bluster, emphasizing competence over intimidation. The inspection team listened intently, occasionally nodding in agreement as highlighted critical issues that Briggs had either ignored or actively concealed. Briggs tried to interrupt, pointing to what he believed were flaws in her reporting. "I don't believe these claims. We've been operating efficiently. This is nonsense." His voice cracked with frustration, met his gaze without flinching, her tone steady. "Colonel, the evidence speaks for itself. These are facts through direct observation, documentation, and personnel interviews. Opinions or rank cannot negate operational realities." Her words were firm but professional, dismantling his defenses without resorting to ridicule or anger. The inspection team, now fully engaged, asked detailed questions about operations, safety protocols, and leadership practices. Responded with precision, citing specific examples and recommending actionable improvements. Every answer she gave highlighted both her knowledge and her authority. Briggs, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, realizing that his reputation, carefully built over years of dominance, was being dismantled before his eyes. His earlier arrogance, mocking her publicly, dismissing her authority, had created a foundation for his own downfall. Soldiers in the room watched the unfolding events with awe. Many had feared Briggs for years, witnessing his sarcastic ridicule and intimidation firsthand. Now, they saw a model of leadership that was calm, competent, and effective. They noticed the stark contrast between fear-based authority and earned respect. Some whispered quietly to one another, recognizing that Fort was entering a new era. For the first time, they felt that accountability and professional competence mattered more than rank alone. By the end of the presentation, the inspection team had reviewed every aspect of the base: operations, morale, safety, and leadership practices, concluded with a clear plan for reform, emphasizing the importance of training, accountability, and morale building. Her recommendations were practical, precise, and backed by weeks of meticulous investigation. Briggs, once the undisputed figure of authority, now sat in humiliation, unable to defend himself or his methods. Every sarcastic remark he had made, every attempt to dominate, now contributed to his undoing. The inspection team, impressed by her diligence, expertise, and leadership, commended for her work. They indicated immediate corrective actions and recommended disciplinary review for leadership failures. Briggs attempted one last feeble defense, but it was clear that his credibility had evaporated. Had not attacked him personally, she had simply presented facts and evidence. The result was both public and undeniable. Briggs had been outclassed. After the meeting, quietly gathered her notes. She knew that the base's transformation would take time, patience, and careful implementation, but the first major hurdle had been crossed. Soldiers approached her cautiously, expressing gratitude and relief. They no longer feared ridicule for raising concerns. They saw that leadership could be competent, fair, and authoritative without being cruel. Briggs, still reeling from the revelation, retreated to his office, fully aware that his arrogance had brought him to this point, yet powerless to reverse it. Reflected privately on the day's events. She had arrived quietly, observed diligently, and now, through methodical preparation and calm authority, she had established control without confrontation. The colonel's ego had blinded him at every turn, and patience, professionalism, and evidence had revealed the truth. Fort, long held hostage by fear-based leadership, was finally poised for reform. The storm that had been gathering silently over weeks had erupted, and the base, and Colonel Briggs, would never be the same again. As night fell, walked the perimeter once more, reviewing her mental notes and planning the next steps for reform. Soldiers glanced at her with admiration, hope, and renewed confidence. The base had changed today, not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet, decisive authority. And somewhere deep in his office, Briggs sat in stunned silence, fully aware that the woman he had mocked and underestimated had completely outmaneuvered him. Carter had arrived, and Fort would never be the same. The morning sun rose over Fort, casting a golden light on the sprawling grounds, now buzzing with a quiet, renewed energy. Soldiers moved with purpose, boots striking in rhythm against the pavement, yet there was a noticeable difference. Confidence replaced the usual fear. Commander Carter walked the perimeter with measured steps, her notebook in hand. She observed carefully, noting the subtle changes in morale, the way soldiers held themselves taller, and the quiet glances of respect that followed her. She had earned their trust not through intimidation, but through competence, clarity, and consistency. Colonel Briggs, meanwhile, sat rigid in his office, fuming over the previous day's events. The revelation of his true rank had shattered his carefully constructed image of authority. For the first time, he felt the sting of being outmaneuvered, not through confrontation, but through preparation, evidence, and calm authority. Attempts to assert dominance now fell flat. The inspection team had left clear directives. Reforms were mandatory, accountability was non-negotiable, and Briggs's methods were no longer tolerated. He was aware of the consequences, yet powerless to reverse the shift that had occurred under his quiet guidance. Began her day with a detailed meeting of senior officers. She laid out the immediate priorities for operational reform, updated safety protocols, strict adherence to maintenance schedules, and a transparent reporting system. She emphasized collaboration, accountability, and precision, making it clear that these changes were essential for both operational effectiveness and troop morale. Her tone was calm, authoritative, and supportive, encouraging input without fear. Officers who had once hidden errors under intimidation now spoke openly, offering suggestions and insights that had previously gone unheard. The implementation of reforms began in small, deliberate steps. Oversaw the maintenance of vehicles, personally checking logs against the physical condition of equipment. Soldiers who had previously feared speaking up now reported issues openly, knowing that focus was on solutions rather than blame. Minor successes accumulated quickly. Overdue inspections were completed, procedural errors corrected, and the morale of troops visibly improved. The contrast with Briggs's earlier reign of fear was stark. Where intimidation once dictated obedience, competence and respect now guided action. Briggs attempted to interfere, issuing orders he assumed would reassert his control. "Ignore that," he barked at a sergeant, referring to a new protocol had implemented. "We'll do it my way." But the sergeant, emboldened by his presence and her clear authority, hesitated, intervened with calm precision. "Colonel Briggs, the new procedure ensures safety and efficiency. Please allow it to proceed." Her tone was firm yet respectful, leaving no room for argument. Briggs, realizing he could not override her without exposing further weakness, retreated into silence. As the week progressed, focused not only on operational reforms but on the human aspect of leadership. She spoke privately with non-commissioned officers, medics, and soldiers who had long operated under fear. She listened without judgment, validated concerns, and acknowledged the systemic failures that had persisted under Briggs. Slowly, the base began to heal psychologically. Soldiers reported feeling empowered, training became more precise, and communication improved. Understood that trust was fragile, but with consistency and competence, it could be rebuilt quickly. One particularly revealing moment occurred during a tactical exercise. A squad leader reported a critical error in the deployment sequence. Under Briggs, this would have resulted in public humiliation or reprimand. The error was corrected professionally, and the squad leader was encouraged to analyze the mistake for future improvement. The lesson was clear. Accountability did not require fear, but discipline and guidance. Soldiers began to approach proactively, reporting issues before they became problems. A dramatic shift from the secrecy and suppression they had practiced under Briggs. Meanwhile, Briggs's frustration grew. Each time he attempted to assert dominance, he was reminded, subtly, consistently, that his authority was no longer unquestioned. His sarcasm, mocking gestures, and attempts at intimidation now fell flat, often drawing quiet, incredulous glances from officers and soldiers alike. His calm authority and strategic oversight highlighted the contrast between fear-driven leadership and competence-based respect. For the first time, Briggs felt isolated, unable to command loyalty through intimidation, reliant instead on a reputation that had been publicly and privately questioned. Used this opportunity strategically. She conducted regular briefings, walking officers through both successes and failures with precision. She highlighted improvements, giving credit where due, and identified areas for continued attention. By reinforcing positive behavior and ensuring transparency, she the cultural shift within the base. Soldiers, officers, and even hesitant NCOs began to recognize that their efforts were meaningful and appreciated. The morale of Fort, long suppressed by fear and arrogance, began to rise steadily. The psychological transformation of the base mirrored operational improvements. Drills became more efficient, errors decreased, and communication lines that had previously been silent now hummed with proactive collaboration. His presence was a stabilizing force, demonstrating that leadership was about competence, fairness, and strategic insight rather than ego or intimidation. Soldiers looked to her for guidance, officers respected her direction, and even Briggs, though bitter, began to grudgingly follow her lead. By the end of the week, convened a final review session with senior officers. She praised the collective efforts of the team, highlighted critical areas for ongoing improvement, and emphasized the importance of sustaining the cultural shift. Her calm authority and meticulous preparation left no doubt in anyone's mind. Fort had changed, and the era of fear-driven leadership was over. Briggs sat in the room, rigid and silent, fully aware that his previous methods had been dismantled without a single public confrontation. As night fell, walked the perimeter once more. Soldiers passed her with nods, smiles, and quiet words of gratitude. She felt a deep satisfaction knowing that trust had been rebuilt, authority properly established, and competence recognized over ego. Fort had begun to transform into a base where operations, morale, and leadership were aligned, and where fear no longer dictated behavior. The seeds of change had taken root, and under watchful guidance they would continue to flourish. In her quarters, reviewed her notes and reflected on the week. She had not sought conflict, yet she had strategically dismantled fear-based leadership, rebuilt trust, and restored operational integrity. She had demonstrated with calm authority that true leadership relies on competence, preparation, and respect rather than intimidation. And as she prepared for the following week, she knew the final phase of reform, ensuring long-term accountability and cultural transformation, was within reach. Fort, once a base dominated by fear and arrogance, now stood on the threshold of a new era, guided by quiet, unwavering authority. The dawn broke over Fort with a quiet intensity, sunlight spilling across the training grounds and casting long shadows of the soldiers standing at attention. The base, once dominated by fear and intimidation, now vibrated with a renewed sense of purpose. Commanders, officers, and enlisted personnel moved with confidence and precision, aware of the authority that guided them, not through ego, but through competence, integrity, and fairness. Carter walked among them, notebook in hand, quietly observing the transformation she had meticulously cultivated over weeks. Colonel Briggs, once the unchallenged figure of authority, now sat in his office in stunned silence. The inspections, the documentation, and strategic leadership had left him powerless. Every sarcastic remark, every mocking gesture, every public attempt to undermine had been recorded, analyzed, and revealed to higher command. Today, he would face accountability, a reckoning for his arrogance and failure to lead effectively. For weeks, he had underestimated, and the consequences were now undeniable. The high-level review board from the Pentagon arrived in the late morning. Officers lined the halls, anticipating the formal evaluation that would determine the fate of the base's leadership. Calm and poised, stood at the center of the room, presenting the documented evidence of systemic inefficiencies, safety violations, and leadership failures under Briggs. Each report was precise, factual, and professionally delivered, leaving no space for argument or deflection. Briggs attempted to interject, but the board, aware of the documented evidence and authority, allowed only her voice to guide the proceedings. Methodically presented her findings. She highlighted areas where procedural errors had persisted due to fear-driven compliance, equipment mismanagement that jeopardized safety, and morale issues that had eroded the effectiveness of operations. She also documented Briggs's repeated attempts to mock and intimidate personnel, including the public humiliations directed at her during the early stages of her assignment. Her voice remained calm, her demeanor professional, and her evidence irrefutable. Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His usual tactics of sarcasm and intimidation were powerless in the face of meticulously documented facts. The board members listened intently, occasionally nodding, their expressions a mixture of surprise and solemnity. Had transformed what might have been a routine evaluation into a compelling case for accountability. Her thorough preparation, attention to detail, and unwavering composure left no doubt about the failures in leadership and the necessity for change. When she concluded, proposed a path forward for the base. She recommended operational reforms, training programs, and a transparent reporting system to prevent future lapses. She emphasized the importance of leadership accountability, the need for competence over ego, and the necessity of a culture built on respect rather than fear. Her proposals were practical, actionable, and grounded in evidence, ensuring that Fort would not only recover but thrive. The board deliberated quietly, reviewing notes and reports, while Briggs's face reflected a mixture of disbelief, shame, and begrudging recognition. When the decision was announced, it was swift and decisive. Colonel Briggs would be relieved of command pending further review, and the chain of command would be restructured to ensure accountability. was appointed as acting commander of fort, her leadership recognized and validated at the highest levels. The room erupted in subdued relief and quiet applause from officers and soldiers alike. Outside the boardroom, soldiers gathered in small groups, discussing the news in hushed, excited tones. They had witnessed a profound transformation, the fall of fear-driven leadership and the rise of authority rooted in competence and respect. Some recalled past humiliations, sarcastic mockery, and tense drills under Briggs. Now they experienced hope, confidence, and a renewed sense of purpose under his command. Morale, long suppressed, soared. Soldiers began taking initiative, offering suggestions for improvement, and collaborating with one another in ways previously unthinkable. Did not bask in personal glory. She immediately began organizing operational improvements, delegating responsibilities, and establishing clear communication channels. Safety protocols were reinforced, maintenance schedules rigorously implemented, and training exercises conducted with renewed focus and precision. Her calm, deliberate guidance fostered accountability without fear, and her transparent approach encouraged soldiers and officers to engage actively in the process. For the first time in years, Fort operated as a cohesive, confident unit. Briggs, meanwhile, was escorted from the base by protocol officers. The once mighty colonel, whose arrogance had blinded him to the truth, faced a formal review of his conduct and leadership failures. He remained defiant in small ways, muttering complaints under his breath, but even he could not deny the undeniable transformation that had enacted. His ego, once inflated by mockery and intimidation, had been dismantled by competence, preparation, and calm authority. The lesson was clear. Rank without integrity and competence is fragile. Arrogance invites accountability. In the weeks that followed, worked closely with senior officers and non-commissioned leaders to solidify the cultural shift she had begun. She encouraged collaboration, rewarded initiative, and emphasized the importance of professional respect and operational excellence. Soldiers began taking pride in their work, understanding that their efforts were meaningful, recognized, and valued. Training drills improved, errors decreased, and communication flowed freely. Fort had not only survived the upheaval, it had been fundamentally transformed into a base capable of exceptional performance. One afternoon, as walked across the training grounds, she observed a squad conducting maneuvers with precision, discipline, and confidence. Soldiers moved with purpose, communicating openly and correcting minor errors constructively. A junior officer approached, nodding respectfully. "Ma'am, we've noticed a huge difference since you took command. People are actually eager to do their best now," smiled faintly. "That's the point," she replied. "Leadership is about enabling people, not intimidating them. When you feel respected and competent, you perform better." The transformation extended beyond operations. Fort's culture shifted from one of fear to one of accountability and mutual respect. Officers who had once hidden errors under intimidation now reported issues openly, contributing to problem-solving rather than avoidance. Soldiers felt empowered, engaged, and committed to the mission. Its leadership had created a sustainable environment where competence, integrity, and respect formed the foundation of authority. By the end of her tenure at Fort, had cemented a legacy that would endure long after her departure. The base operated efficiently, morale was high, and leadership was held to a standard of accountability and competence. Her calm authority, strategic foresight, and unwavering professionalism had transformed a fear-driven environment into a model of effective military operations. Even the highest-ranking officers acknowledged her impact, recognizing that true leadership is demonstrated through action, not ego. As she prepared to leave Fort, reflected on the journey. She had arrived quietly, observed diligently, and enacted change with precision and patience. Arrogance had been dismantled, fear replaced by respect, and incompetence addressed through meticulous documentation and reform. Soldiers, officers, and the base itself had been transformed, standing as a testament to the power of calm authority, integrity, and unwavering dedication to the mission. And somewhere in the aftermath of his downfall, Colonel Briggs understood, too late, that mocking, belittling, and underestimating Carter had been his greatest mistake. Authority without competence, ego without insight, and arrogance without accountability could not withstand meticulous preparation and professional excellence. Fort had changed, and its leadership had ensured that it would never return to the shadows of fear and humiliation again. The base thrived under her guidance. Soldiers carried themselves with renewed confidence, and the lesson was clear to all. True leadership commands respect, earns trust, and elevates others, not through fear, but through competence, integrity, and unwavering commitment. Carter had arrived, observed, and transformed Fort forever.